Rachel Morrison was 43 years old, and she had been married for 16 years to a man who would, if you asked anyone who knew them to describe him in a single word, be called good. Not handsome, though he was pleasant looking enough. Not exciting, though he was reliable. Not romantic, though he was faithful. Just good, in the way that a well-maintained appliance is good, functional, predictable, incapable of surprising you. His name was Brian Morrison. He was a structural engineer at a civil engineering firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of man who wore khakis and a button-down shirt to work and came home smelling of coffee and drafting paper. He was not unkind. He did not yell. He did not gamble or drink or look at other women. He mowed the lawn every Saturday morning with a consistency that bordered on religious devotion. He loaded the dishwasher in exactly the way the manufacturer recommended, and he became visibly agitated when Rachel loaded it differently. He remembered their anniversary, a fact he tracked in a shared Google Calendar that sent them both reminders 3 weeks in advance, and he bought her gifts that were sensible and appropriate, a KitchenAid mixer she had mentioned once in passing 18 months earlier, a new phone when her old one started lagging, a spa gift card that she used gratefully because he had no idea what else to give her. Brian loved her. Rachel did not doubt this. The love was simply, how could she put it without sounding cruel, without sounding like the villain in a story she had never intended to star in, insufficient. Not insufficient in quantity but in quality. It was the love of a man who had built a comfortable life and expected that comfort to be enough. It was the love that showed up on time and did its job and went to bed at a reasonable hour. It was the love that checked the boxes and forgot to look up from the checklist. The deficiency, if you could call it that, was most visible in the bedroom. Brian was not incompetent. He was not careless. He performed the acts of sex with a methodical efficiency that Rachel had, in the early years of their marriage, mistaken for confidence. He touched her in the expected places for the expected duration. He kissed her, on the mouth, on the neck, in the sequences that he had determined, over 16 years of marriage, to be the correct sequences. He finished, and he rolled over, and he was asleep within 4 minutes, and Rachel lay beside him in the dark and thought about the ceiling and the grocery list and the question that had begun to haunt her around year 8 of their marriage, is this all there is? She had tried, in the early years, to talk to him about it. She had approached it gently, the way you approach a sleeping animal, not wanting to startle it, wanting to coax it towards something better. Brian, she had said one night, curled against his side in their bed in the house in the suburbs, I wish we could talk more. About us. About our intimacy. He had listened. He had nodded. He had said, in all sincerity, I love you, Rachel. You know that. I know, she had said. I just wish we could explore more. Try new things. I feel like we have fallen into a pattern. What kind of pattern, he had asked, genuinely puzzled. And Rachel had realized, in that moment, that the pattern was invisible to him. He could not see it because he was not looking for it. He was not the kind of man who lay awake at night asking himself hard questions about the quality of his own life. He was the kind of man who assumed that if no one was complaining, things were fine. So she stopped asking. Rachel worked as a regional training manager for a pharmaceutical company whose name she had trouble explaining to people at dinner parties, something about clinical trial logistics and continuing medical education for healthcare providers across the Southeast. It was a good job. It paid well, offered dental insurance, and required her to travel to Atlanta and Tampa and Nashville 4 or 5 times a month for conferences and workshops and client meetings. She was good at it. She was warm and organized and projected a competence that made people trust her within 5 minutes of meeting her. She had a standing weekly call with her team on Monday mornings and a running joke with her assistant, a 26-year-old named Deanna who wore bold earrings and called everyone hun. She had met her lover. She still did not have a good word for him. Lover felt too romantic. Affair partner felt too clinical. The other man felt like a country song. At a national sales meeting in Savannah in March of the previous year. His name was Michael Tran. He was 46, the national sales director for the same pharmaceutical company's competitor, and he had introduced himself to Rachel at the cocktail reception in the hotel's grand ballroom with a handshake that lingered a half-second too long and a smile that suggested he was seeing something other than her conference badge. Rough industry, huh? He had said, nodding at the bar. Thought you'd be used to rough, she had said, glancing at his badge. National Sales Director. That's got to come with armor. He had laughed, a real laugh, not the polite corporate chuckle she was accustomed to from conference acquaintances. Armor gets heavy, though. I'm Michael. Rachel. They had talked for 40 minutes that night, standing near the ice sculpture, a corporate logo that was already melting at the fins, and she had learned, in fragments, the broad strokes of his life. He was from Houston originally but had moved to Dallas for work and then to Atlanta for more work. He was married, 2 kids, a daughter in college, a son in high school, and a wife who, he said with a careful neutrality that Rachel would later learn to read as a form of verdict, had her own life. Rachel had not intended anything. She was 42 then, approaching the age where the hormones that had driven her through her 20s and 30s were beginning, she suspected, to quiet down, and where she had started to feel something she had not expected, relief. The hunger that had plagued her through her marriage, the persistent, embarrassing, shameful gap between what she wanted and what Brian offered, seemed, for a few months in her early 40s, to be receding. She told herself she was growing out of it. She told herself it was a phase. She told herself that the quiet, manageable intimacy she had with Brian was, in fact, more than enough, and that the wanting she had felt for so long had been a mistake, an immaturity, a lie she had told herself in her 20s. She saw Michael again at 2 more conferences over the following months, Orlando in June, Chicago in September, and each time, the conversation between them carried an undercurrent she could not ignore. It was not, strictly speaking, flirtation. It was something more specific than that. It was the recognition, on both sides, that they were both people who understood something about the other that most people did not understand, the exhaustion of being professionally competent and personally starving. It was in Chicago, at the closing dinner of a 3-day hematology conference she barely remembered, that Michael had, over coffee in the hotel lobby after the speeches had ended, said to her, "I think about our conversations more than I should." Rachel had looked at him. He was a good-looking man, salt and pepper hair worn slightly longer than corporate convention dictated, a jawline that had softened with middle age but was still strong, brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He was wearing a blue blazer that looked expensive. He looked like a man who had decided, at some point in his 40s, to stop fighting the fact that he was attractive and start using it. "I think about them too," Rachel had said. "I'm not looking to blow up anyone's life," Michael had said carefully. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not in love with you, Rachel. I don't think that's what this is." "I know," she had said. And she had meant it. What she felt for Michael was not love. It was something older and stranger and more honest than that, recognition. The feeling of finding, after years of wandering in a landscape that looked like everyone else's life but did not feel like her own, another person who was genuinely, recognizably lost in the same way. "Then what is it?" she had asked. Michael had looked at his coffee for a long moment. "I think," he had said slowly, "that it's 2 people who have figured out what they want, and are finally brave enough to go get it. They agreed, in the weeks after Chicago, on the terms of their arrangement with a pragmatism that Rachel found both liberating and faintly depressing. They would not be in love. They would not be boyfriend and girlfriend. They would not do weekend getaways or exchange gifts on Valentine's Day or text each other constantly throughout the day with declarations of missing each other. They would meet, not frequently, not more than twice a month at most, in hotels that neither of them had any personal connection to. They would have sex. They would leave. They would not, under any circumstances, interfere with each other's marriages or families. Rachel had typed up the terms in a Google Doc. She was, above all else, an organized woman, and sent them to Michael with the subject line TLDR. He had responded with a single line, "This is perfect. You're perfect. See you in April." The first time they met, a Wednesday afternoon in April, at a business-class hotel near the Savannah airport that neither of them had any reason to be at, Rachel had been so nervous that she almost did not go through with it. She had driven from Charlotte, 3 hours on I-85 South, and sat in the hotel parking lot for 15 minutes with the engine running and a radio playing soft rock at a volume she could not hear over the sound of her own pulse. She thought about Brian, at home, probably eating leftover pasta for dinner and watching ESPN. She thought about her daughter, Emma, 20 years old and at college in Chapel Hill, who called her mother every Sunday evening with a regularity that was both touching and, in the context of what Rachel was about to do, a source of blinding guilt. She thought about Michael, upstairs in room 614, waiting. She went inside. He was standing at a window when she entered, looking out at the parking lot, and he turned when he heard the door close and smiled at her. Not the smile of a man who was going to pretend this was something it wasn't, but the smile of a man who was happy to see her and clear about why. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. They stood there for a moment, two middle-aged professionals in a hotel room that smelled of industrial linen, and then Michael crossed the room and put his hands on her waist and kissed her, softly at first, then with an urgency that matched the months of waiting and the specific quality of wanting they had both been carrying, and Rachel thought, "Oh. So this is still possible. I am still someone who can feel this." The sex was good. Better than good. Michael was attentive in a way that Brian had never been, not because Brian was selfish and bad, but because Michael had spent 20 years of marriage paying attention to his wife's responses and learning, as a matter of discipline, how to be present with another person in a way that made them feel seen. He asked Rachel what she wanted. He watched her face. He touched her the way a musician plays an instrument, not randomly, not by formula, but with genuine curiosity about the sound she would make if he adjusted his approach by a single degree. When it was over, they lay beside each other on the hotel bed, the curtains drawn against the Savannah afternoon, and Michael said, "That was really good." It was, Rachel agreed. "I'm going to take a shower and leave in about 20 minutes, he said. "I'll text you when I get home." "Okay." He kissed her forehead, a gesture that was startlingly tender, and that Rachel would remember every time they met afterward. Then he got up and went to the bathroom, and she heard the water running, and she lay there on the bed and felt something she had not felt in years, that she was exactly where she wanted to be. Michael texted her when he got home, as promised, "Made it. That was perfect. Same time next month?" She texted back, "Yes." And that was the extent of their contact for the next 4 weeks. Rachel told no one. This was perhaps the most important term of their agreement, and the one that she enforced with a rigor that surprised even her. She did not tell her best friend, Karen, a fellow soccer mom from the suburb where they used to live who had been Rachel's confidant for 20 years and who would have, Rachel knew, had opinions. She did not tell her sister, Melissa, who had been through a divorce 7 years earlier and who still carried, in the brittleness of her attitude toward men, the evidence of that wound. She did not even tell the voice in her own head, which had begun, in the months after Savannah, to narrate her life with a new and unsettling energy. She compartmentalized with a skill she did not know she possessed. When she was with Brian, at Sunday brunch, at Emma's graduation party, at the neighborhood 4th of July block party where she wore a sundress and made small talk with people whose names she kept forgetting, she was Brian's wife. Present, affectionate, appropriate. When she was in the office, she was Rachel Morrison, regional training manager, competent and warm and utterly without a secret. When she was driving to meet Michael, she became someone else, someone she did not yet have a name for, someone who was only visible in the spaces between one life and the other, a transitional creature who existed only on highways and in hotel parking lots. She told herself, in the months after Savannah, that she was not a bad person. She was a person who had made a choice, a rational, considered, mutually agreed upon choice, about how to meet needs that her marriage did not and could not meet. She was not lying to Emma. She was not risking anyone's health or safety. She was not spending money they could not afford, or neglecting her responsibilities, or allowing her secret to damage the life she had built. She was simply, this was the phrase she kept returning to, like a mantra, living her life. And yet, there were moments when the dissonance became unbearable, when she would be sitting across from Brian at dinner and he would be telling her about a problem at work, a client who was unhappy with a bridge design, a subordinate who had missed a deadline, and she would feel the gap between them open up like a fault line, and she would want to scream, "Don't you know? Don't you know what's happening? Can't you see that I am disappearing right in front of you?" But she never said any of this, because the truth was that Brian would not have known what to do with the information. He would have been hurt, genuinely hurt, in a way that would have been painful to witness, and he would have responded in the way he always responded to things he did not understand, with silence, and then with the slow, wounded withdrawal that had been the defining feature of their marriage for the past decade. So she kept the secret. She kept it in a box in her chest, and she only opened it when she was driving alone on the highway or lying in bed at 2 a.m. while Brian slept beside her with his methodical breathing, or standing in the bathroom mirror applying the red lipstick that Michael had once, in a moment of casual intimacy, said looked incredible on her. The lipstick was her secret too. Brian did not notice it. He had not noticed, in 16 years of marriage, that Rachel wore different shades depending on her mood, that she saved the bold reds for the days when she needed to feel powerful, and that the particular shade she wore on the Wednesday before she was due to see Michael was the one he had complimented. 3 months into their arrangement, Rachel found herself standing in a Victoria's Secret, a store she had not entered voluntarily in 6 years, buying new lingerie. Not the functional cotton basics she wore for Brian, the 3-pack variety from Target that she put in her drawer without looking at. She bought silk. She bought lace. She bought a bra and panty set in deep burgundy that made her feel, when she tried it on in the fitting room, like someone she had forgotten she could be. She started going to the gym with a regularity that impressed even her. Not because Michael had asked her to, he had not, had in fact said, "I like you exactly as you are," but because she liked how she felt when she caught sight of herself in the mirror at the hotel. Stronger. More alive. More like the woman she had been before the years of quiet disappointment had settled on her like sediment. She told herself this was not about Michael. This was about her. She was reclaiming something, her body, her desire, her sense of herself as a sexual being, that she had allowed to atrophy in 16 years of marriage to a man who did not know how to want her. Michael was, in this telling, a catalyst rather than a cause. He was the mirror in which she could finally see herself clearly. Was she lying to herself? Possibly. Did it matter? She was not sure. She thought about this often, the ethics of what she was doing, the moral architecture of infidelity, and the conclusions she reached were never entirely satisfying. She believed, with the conviction of someone who had been married long enough to understand the difference between cruelty and tragedy, that she was not hurting anyone. Brian was not unhappy. Emma was not neglected. Michael's wife, whose name was Susan, a fact Rachel had learned from a LinkedIn search she had conducted one sleepless night, was not being deceived in any way that Rachel's silence could remedy. If Rachel told Brian the truth tomorrow, she would not be making him happy. She would be destroying his peace, taking away the comfortable fiction that his marriage was working, and replacing it with a wound that would never fully heal. What would be the point? Some people, Karen, Melissa, the commenters on the advice forum Rachel sometimes read at 1 a.m., would say that Brian deserved to know, that he had a right to make an informed decision about his marriage, that Rachel's choice to keep this secret was a form of control that denied him his autonomy. Rachel rejected this framing, though she could not entirely defend it. She rejected it because she knew Brian. She knew that if she told him, he would hear only one thing, that she had betrayed him. He would not hear the context, the years of trying to reach him, the conversations she had initiated and the wall she had hit. He would hear, "I don't love you enough." And that would destroy him, not because he was fragile, but because he had built his entire sense of self around being a good husband, and discovering that his goodness had not been sufficient would crack the foundation of everything he believed about himself. So she stayed silent. She made her choice. And she carried it. There was an evening in November, 6 months after Savannah, 4 days after she had seen Michael in Atlanta at a conference they both attended under the pretense of work, that Rachel came closer to confessing than she ever had before or would again. Brian had come home from work in a good mood, which was unusual for a Thursday. He had closed a deal, a major infrastructure project that his firm had been pursuing for 18 months, and he was fizzing with a quiet energy that Rachel had not seen in years. He opened a bottle of wine, the good bottle, the one they kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator for special occasions, and he poured them both a glass and raised his glass and said, "To us." "To us," Rachel said, and clinked her glass against his. They had dinner that night. Brian had ordered takeout from the Thai restaurant Rachel loved, the one on Providence Road where the staff knew them by name, and they sat at the kitchen table and ate pad Thai and drank wine and talked about Emma's upcoming winter break and the trip to Colorado they were planning for their anniversary in February. Brian was engaged in a way that felt new, or perhaps felt like something Rachel had forgotten was possible. He asked her about her work. He listened to her answer, actually listened, leaning forward slightly, nodding, asking follow-up questions. He told her a joke that made her laugh, a real laugh, not the polite laugh she usually offered. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Ratch," he said, and the nickname, which he almost never used, made her chest tighten. "I'm really glad we're doing this." "Doing what?" she said. "Dois," he said, gesturing vaguely at the table. "The wine, the Thai containers, the moment." "Us?" "I know I've been distracted lately. Work has been insane. But I just want you to know that I appreciate you. More than you know." Rachel looked at him, his open face, his slightly flushed cheeks, the earnestness in his eyes that she had fallen in love with 20 years ago and had not seen in a very long time, and she felt the truth rising in her throat like bile. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to say, "I have been sleeping with another man for 6 months. I have been lying to you every single day. I have been wearing red lipstick and silk lingerie and feeling more alive in hotel rooms with a man who does not love me than I have felt in this house in 16 years. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Instead, she said, I appreciate you too, Brian. I really do. He smiled, that same warm, uncomplicated smile that had made her fall in love with him in the first place, and he topped off her wine, and they finished their dinner, and they watched a movie on the couch, and at 10 p.m. Brian went to bed and Rachel stayed up for another hour pretending to read a novel she was not absorbing a single word of, and when she finally went to bed, Brian was asleep, his face peaceful in the glow of his sleep-tracking watch, and Rachel lay in the dark and pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from screaming. She thought often, in the months that followed, about what the therapist she had seen for 2 years before dropping out would have called the root cause of her dissatisfaction. Brian was not a bad husband. Susan, Michael's wife, was not, by all accounts, a bad wife. Their marriages were not disasters. They were not abusive, not toxic, not the kinds of relationships that anyone would look at and say, this needs to end. They were simply insufficient. They were marriages that had calcified into routine, that had traded passion for comfort and called the exchange a fair trade, that had convinced both partners that this was simply what marriage became after a certain number of years, and that wanting more was immature, ungrateful, a failure to appreciate what you had. But Rachel could not accept this. She had read, in the previous year, an article about the neuroscience of romantic love, something her assistant Deanna had sent her, half-jokingly, as a link to a podcast episode, and the research suggested that the brain's love circuits do not simply go offline after a certain number of years of marriage. They remain active, responsive, capable of generating the same dopamine rush that characterized early romance, provided they are stimulated by novelty, by genuine connection, by the experience of being truly seen by another person. The problem, the researcher had concluded, is not that we stop being capable of romantic love. It is that we stop being willing to seek it out, because seeking it out requires admitting that we are not satisfied, and admitting that we are not satisfied requires a courage that most of us, in our middle years, have been socialized out of. Rachel recognized herself in this research. She had spent years telling herself that she was satisfied, that Brian was a good man, that their life was a good life, that the hunger she felt was a character flaw, an immaturity, something she should work on in herself rather than something that deserved to be answered. And then Michael had come along. And he had looked at her, really looked at her, the way Brian had not looked at her in years, with attention and curiosity and a desire that was not merely physical but existential, and Rachel had remembered, in his gaze, that she was someone who deserved to be wanted. And that wanting was not shameful. It was human. There was a conversation she had with Michael, 5 months in, that she thought about often. It was after sex, after the shower, after he had pulled on his slacks and was standing by the door with his blazer over his arm, and he had paused and turned and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you happy?" Rachel had considered the question carefully. "I'm not sure," she said. "I'm more alive than I was. But I'm not sure that's the same thing as happy." Michael nodded. He did not seem disappointed by this answer. "I ask because I think about it too. About whether this," he gestured at the room, at the space between them, at the arrangement they had constructed, "whether this is making things better or just making the parts that were already bad more tolerable." "What do you think?" she asked. "I think it's both," he said. "I think it's both, and I don't know how to feel about that." They had stood there for a moment, two middle-aged people in a hotel room that was already being cleaned by a maid who would never know what had happened in it, and Rachel had thought, "This is the most honest conversation I have had in years." And it was not with Brian. It was with a man I am sleeping with behind my husband's back. And that fact was monstrous, and also true, and she did not know how to reconcile those two things. She told Michael about a comment she had read on a forum, a woman's story about her affair with a married man, and the comment section had been brutal, with women calling the woman every name in the book, accusing her of lacking self-respect and dignity and basic integrity. And the woman who posted the story had replied, at the end, with a line that Rachel had copied into her phone's notes app and read several times since, "You can call it whatever you want. I call it choosing myself. And if that's selfish, then I've been selfless for long enough." Michael had read the note on her phone and looked at her and said, "It's not selfish to want to feel alive." "I know," Rachel had said. "That's the problem." The agreement had a built-in expiration date, though neither of them had formalized it. They both understood that this was a chapter, not a book, that eventually the circumstances of their lives would shift, or the novelty would fade, or one of them would simply run out of the particular kind of courage that was required to keep showing up in hotel rooms and lying to the people who trusted them most. Rachel thought about this often. She thought about the day they would stop, how it would happen, who would end it, what she would feel afterward. She thought about whether she would go back to the person she had been before Michael, or whether she had changed in ways that could not be undone. She thought about Brian, and about whether the secret she carried was a wall between them or a gift, a protection, however dishonest, of the peace he had earned. There was no clean answer. She had learned, in 43 years of living and 16 years of marriage and 6 months of an affair she had never intended to have, that the moral architecture of a life is not a building. It is a city. It is old neighborhoods and new developments and abandoned lots and parks where people walk their dogs and never think about what was there before. It is messy and overlapping and full of contradictions that cannot be resolved but only lived with. She was living with hers. She was doing it quietly, carefully, with a discipline that surprised her. She was showing up for her life, for Brian, for Emma, for her job, for her friends, for the people who depended on her, and she was also showing up, once or twice a month, in hotel rooms with a man who saw her clearly and wanted her anyway, and she did not know if this made her a good person or a bad one, but she suspected that the categories were too simple to contain any of it. One evening in February, nearly a year after Savannah, Rachel was getting ready for bed in the master bathroom of the house in the Charlotte suburbs when Brian appeared in the doorway. He was holding 2 cups of tea, chamomile, her favorite, and he handed her one and said, "Can I sit with you for a minute?" She nodded. They sat on the edge of the bathtub, an odd choice, but the bathroom was warm and the tea was hot, and for a moment they were just 2 people on the edge of something, holding warm cups, not speaking. "Rach," Brian said finally. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About us. About whether there's something I'm missing. Something I'm not giving you." Rachel's heart stopped. She stared into her tea, the steam rising in small, curling wisps, and she said, with a calm she did not feel, "What makes you say that?" Brian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, as if he were picking his way across ice. "I don't know. I just feel like you're here, but you're not here. Like you're waiting for something." Rachel did not cry. She did not confess. She took a sip of tea and let the warmth of it spread through her chest, and she said, "I'm here, Brian. I'm right here." She was not sure if this was a lie. She was not sure if the woman who was sitting in this bathroom with her husband, the woman who had a secret hotel room and a silk bra in her drawer and a Google Calendar reminder that said Atlanta, Michael, was someone who could still say "I'm here" and mean it. But she said it anyway. Because it was what Brian needed to hear. Because it was what their marriage required. Because sometimes love is not the truth, it is what you build to hold the truth at a distance while you figure out how to live with it. Brian nodded. He seemed, if not satisfied, then at least temporarily reassured. He finished his tea and rinsed the cup and went to bed, and Rachel stayed in the bathroom for another 15 minutes, looking at her face in the mirror, the face of a 43-year-old woman who had made a life and a choice and a secret, and who was still, in spite of everything, standing. She did not know what came next. She did not know if she would tell Brian someday, or if she would carry this to the end. She did not know if Michael would end it, or if she would, or if time would end it for both of them by making the risk greater than the reward. She knew only this: she was done pretending that wanting more was the same as not having enough. She was done apologizing for her own hunger. She was done believing that choosing herself was the same as betraying everyone else. She was a good wife. She was a good mother. She was a good friend, a good colleague, a good person, and she was also, every few weeks, in a hotel room in Savannah or Atlanta or Nashville, a woman who was brave enough to want what she wanted and go get it. That was the whole truth. And it was enough to be getting on with. Asterisk. This has been Story 10 from Noah's Awakening, because sometimes the quietest affairs are the ones that say the most. ## Part 5, The Art of Being Wanted. There is a particular kind of loneliness that descends on a woman who has everything she thought she wanted and finds that it is not enough. It is not the loneliness of being single. That loneliness has a cure, a clear object, a path toward resolution. It is the loneliness of being married, of being witnessed in the daily rituals of coupledom, of sleeping next to another body every night and still feeling utterly, incomprehensibly alone. Rachel was living that loneliness. She was breathing it. She was going to work and coming home and making dinner for Brian and driving Emma to her weekend activities and attending neighborhood gatherings where she smiled and laughed and made small talk with people whose names she kept forgetting, and through all of it, there was a second life running parallel to a real one, a secret life that existed in hotel rooms and text messages, and a particular quality of anticipation that she felt every time she opened her phone and saw Michael's name. The weeks after Savannah were the longest of her life. Every day she woke up and made a choice not to reach for her phone. Every day she went to work and ran her meetings and praised her team and smiled at her assistant Deanna, who noticed nothing because why would she? And she came home and she was present, fully present, for Brian and Emma and the life she had built, and the presence was real and also it was a performance, and the effort of sustaining both at the same time was exhausting in ways she had never been warned about. She started to notice things about herself that frightened her. The way she would catch her reflection in the bathroom mirror and feel, for a split second, like she was looking at a stranger. The way she would be in the middle of a sentence, setting the table, driving the car, halfway through a presentation slide, and lose the thread of her own thought, her mind sliding sideways into a daydream that was not about her family or her work, but about a version of herself that existed somewhere else, in some other narrative where she was wanted and seen and touched with intention. The way Brian would look at her across the dinner table with that open, trusting expression, and she would feel a wave of guilt so intense it took her breath away, followed immediately by a wave of anger, at herself, at him, at the entire architecture of a marriage that had left her so hungry in the first place. She started reading, late at night, after Brian had gone to sleep. Not work documents or design blogs anymore. Forums. Other women's stories. She found a community, a subreddit, actually, called r/married and looking, that was exactly what it sounded like. A gathering place for people who were married and not getting what they needed and were looking for something, whether they knew what that something was or not. She read stories for hours. She read about women who had done what she was thinking about doing and had no regrets. She read about women who had done it and had ruined their lives. She read about women who had chosen not to do it and had spent the rest of their marriages feeling like they were slowly drowning. She read until 3 a.m. and then closed the app and lay in the dark and felt more alone than she had ever felt. One night in late November, when the Charlotte suburbs had begun to look like a Hallmark movie set with the Christmas decorations going up on every lawn, Rachel made a decision. She texted Michael. Not a long message. Just, miss you. He replied within 20 minutes, *, miss you too. Counting down to January, *. They had agreed, at their last meeting in Atlanta, to meet again in January, the annual pharma conference in New Orleans, which neither of them had any professional reason to attend but which both of them had immediately, without discussing it, recognized as the perfect cover. A city neither of them lived in. A hotel neither of them had any connection to. 3 days of conference schedules that would give them perfect, deniable windows of availability. January felt very far away. But the text, the brief, simple exchange, was enough. For a few days afterward, Rachel walked through her life with a different quality of light, as if someone had adjusted the exposure on the camera of her daily existence and everything looked slightly more golden, slightly more bearable. Brian noticed. Of course he did, eventually. People always do. Ratch, he said one Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and a Charlotte Observer, *, you seem different lately. Good different. Like, lighter, *. She felt the guilt move through her like a wave. She looked at him, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his hair slightly disheveled from the shower, the particular way he held the newspaper folded vertically so he could read it without it blocking his view of the room, and she felt love for him, real love, the complicated kind that coexists with betrayal and does not cancel it out. I've been trying to take better care of myself, she said. *, you know. Exercise more. Sleep more. That kind of thing, *. He nodded. He seemed satisfied with this answer. He returned to his newspaper, and Rachel returned to the egg she was scrambling, and the moment passed, and nothing was different, and everything was different, and the distance between them, the one she could not name and he could not see, grew another imperceptible inch wider. Part 6, New Orleans and after. New Orleans in January was everything Rachel had hoped and nothing she had expected. The conference hotel was a grand old property on Bouron Street, all soaring ceilings and worn velvet and the particular smell of old buildings and new money that characterized the city's historic hotels. Michael arrived on the second day. He had texted ahead, a precise, businesslike message, * landed. Roommate 14. Tonight works, *, and Rachel spent the entire morning in a continuing education session about oncology drug pipelines, pretending to take notes while she thought about the hotel room and the hours stretching between now and 8 p.m. They met in the hotel bar first. It was important to them, this was part of the ritual they had developed, to spend at least 30 minutes in a public space before retreating to private territory. To be two people having a drink, a conversation, the ordinary intimacy of a first date, before becoming what they became in the hotel room. It was, Rachel thought, their way of convincing themselves that this was not purely transactional, that there was something real between them beyond the physical. Michael looked tired. He told her about a difficult conversation with his son, Derek, the 16-year-old who was, according to Michael, going through something, and about a work situation at his company where a major account was threatening to leave. He spoke about these things with the frank, slightly exhausted candor of a man who had not told anyone the truth in a very long time. Rachel listened. She told him about Emma's college applications, which were occupying an increasing share of her mental bandwidth, and about a situation at work where one of her top trainers had given notice and she was scrambling to find a replacement before the spring conference season kicked off. They talked about their weeks, their lives, their children. It was, on the surface, mundane. Underneath, it was the most intimate conversation Rachel had had in years. At 8:15, they went upstairs. The sex in New Orleans was different from the sex in Atlanta or Savannah. It was slower, more deliberate, more focused on the long game of two people who had learned each other's rhythms well enough to stop washing. Michael kissed her for a long time before he touched her anywhere else, not her mouth, but her neck, her collarbone, the sensitive hollow behind her ear, and Rachel felt the tension leave her body in waves, like water receding from a shore. He asked her what she wanted. She told him. He told her. They moved together with a synchronicity that surprised her every time, as if their bodies had learned a language that their minds had not yet caught up to. Afterward, lying in the tangle of hotel sheets with the curtains drawn against the New Orleans night, Rachel said, "I think about Susan a lot." Michael did not respond immediately. He was lying on his back, one arm behind his head, the other hand resting on her hip. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "What do you think about? Asterisk whether she knows. Whether she's like me, pretending not to know because the alternative is worse. Whether the whole thing is just this asterisk." She gestured at the room, at the space between them, at the arrangement they had constructed. Two people who are too tired to leave their marriages, so they meet in hotels instead. Michael was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was gentle in a way that made her chest ache. Asterisk, "I don't think about Susan when I'm with you. And I think that's what makes this real." Asterisk. "That's a terrible thing to say," Rachel said. "Why?" Asterisk, "Because it means you're not thinking about the damage. You're just here. And being here is making me feel things I shouldn't feel." Asterisk. Michael turned onto his side and looked at her. His face in the half-light was older than she usually saw it, more lined, more tired. Asterisk, "Rachel, I am not a good man. I need you to understand that about me. I left my wife in every way that mattered years ago. I just didn't have the guts to leave the house. So I found another way to stop pretending. That's what this is. It's not an affair. It's the first honest thing I've done in 20 years." Asterisk. Rachel looked at him. She did not know what to say. "You don't have to feel guilty about me," Michael said. Asterisk, "I'm not a victim. I'm a person who made a choice. Just like you." Asterisk. She leaned over and kissed him. It was not a sexual kiss. It was something more, a kiss of recognition, of two people who had found each other in the dark and were trying, in the only way they knew how, to be honest about why they were there. They continued to meet, once in February in Charleston, once in March in Tampa, once in May in Nashville when the Pharmacy Association held its annual spring summit at the Grand Ole Opryland Hotel. Each time, the ritual was the same: the bar first, then the room, then the long, slow hours of intimacy, physical and conversational, that Rachel had come to depend on with a regularity that worried her. She could admit to herself, addicted. Not to the sex specifically, though the sex was good. Addicted to the feeling of being seen. To the conversation afterward, lying in hotel sheets while the world outside continued without them. To the version of herself who existed in those rooms, more alive, more curious, more willing to ask hard questions and sit with uncomfortable answers, and who disappeared the moment she walked back into her real life. Brian noticed the Charleston trip. "Another work trip?" he asked, looking at the shared calendar. "Training summit," she said. "I'll be back Sunday." "Have a good time," he said. He did not kiss her goodbye at the airport. He had never been a kisser at airports, too public, too performative, and she had long ago stopped expecting him to break that pattern. She kissed him, instead, on the cheek, quickly, The way you kiss an elderly relative. In Charleston, she and Michael walked through the historic district on a Thursday afternoon, two professionals in their mid-40s who had invented reasons to be in the same city. They held hands, a novelty for them since they never touched in public, and Michael bought her a small pair of earrings from a jewelry cart on Market Street, and she wore them for the rest of the trip and thought about the fact that Brian had not bought her jewelry in years, had in fact never really bought her jewelry at all, preferring instead the practical gifts, the KitchenAid, the phone, the spot cards, that said I know you need things and here are things. The earrings were not expensive. They were, objectively, cheap, tourist trinkets, the kind you buy on a whim and forget about by the time you get home. But Rachel treasured them with an intensity that embarrassed her. She kept them in a small jewelry box in her closet, separate from her other earrings, and sometimes, when she was alone in the house, she would open the box and look at them and remember the afternoon in Charleston and the way Michael had said these reminded me of you and the particular quality of sunlight that had been falling through the cart's awning and making his face glow. She did not tell Brian about the earrings. She wore them, sometimes, to dinner, not the Charleston earring, but other earrings, ordinary ones, and she wondered if Brian ever noticed what she wore, or if she could disappear entirely and he would not notice for days. This was the cruelty of her situation. The man she was lying to would have given her anything if she had asked. But she could not ask, because asking would mean explaining why she needed it, and explaining would mean telling him the truth, and telling him the truth would mean ending the life she had built, and she was not ready to end it. She loved Brian in her complicated, guilty, insufficient way. She loved Emma. She loved the house in the suburbs and the Sunday morning newspapers and the life she had made, even if that life had left her so hungry that she had to feed on the crumbs of another man's attention to survive. Part 7, The View from the Other Side of the Bed. Brian Morrison would not have described himself as an unhappy man. If you had asked him, and no one ever did, in quite those terms, he would have said that his life was good. He had a job he was competent at. He had a wife he loved. He had a daughter who was brilliant and occasionally kind to him. He had a house with a lawn he maintained with care. He had a retirement account, a life insurance policy, a shared Google Calendar that never missed an anniversary or a dentist appointment. By any external measure, his life was the life he had set out to build when he was 25 years old and sitting across a restaurant table from Rachel Chen. Yes, Chen. She had kept her maiden name, as she had always said she would, and telling her, with an earnestness that embarrassed him now, that he wanted to marry her and have children with her and grow old with her. He had meant every word. He meant them still. What Brian did not have, what he had never quite had, though he had not known to miss it until recently, was a way of talking about the interior of his own life. He was a structural engineer, not a therapist. His job was to understand load-bearing forces and weight distribution and the physics of things staying up. He did not have a framework for understanding why, on certain nights, he would look at Rachel across the dinner table and feel a distance between them that he could not name or measure or design a solution for. He had tried, in the early years of their marriage, to be romantic, flowers on anniversaries, surprise weekend getaways, a weekend in Charleston for their 5th anniversary where he had planned a sunset sail that turned out to be cancelled due to weather, and instead they had walked through the historic district in the rain and eaten beignets and Café du Monde, and Rachel had laughed and said this is actually better, and he had felt, for a moment, like the luckiest man alive. But the trying had felt, even to him, slightly artificial, like he was following a recipe for a dish he could not taste. Eventually, the trying had faded, as all effort fades when it is not sustained by visible results, and Brian had settled into the comfortable grooves of a marriage that worked on the surface and had quietly abandoned its ambitions below it. He noticed, in the past year, that Rachel seemed different. Not worse, exactly. Not colder. But different, more present in some moments, more absent in others, like a radio signal that kept dropping in and out. She was going to the gym more. She had bought new clothes, a silk robe he did not remember her owning, a dress that made her look, he thought with a small, secret pride, like $1,000,000. She was more attentive to her appearance in a way that he initially attributed to a midlife thing, the way people sometimes suddenly decide to take care of themselves when they hit 40 and realize they are, in fact, mortal. He mentioned it to her once early in the year. They were lying in bed, not in the context of sex, which had become, he was vaguely aware, increasingly rare, but simply lying, side by side, reading their respective screens. "You look really good, Ratch," he said, and he had meant it warmly, supportively, the way a husband is supposed to tell his wife she looks good. And Rachel had turned to him with an expression he could not quite read, surprise, maybe, or gratitude, or something more complicated than either, and she had said, "Thank you," in a voice that was slightly breathless, and he had thought, good. That was good. She seemed pleased. He did not know about Michael. He did not know about Savannah or Atlanta or the hotel room near the convention center where his wife was being touched with attention and intention by a man who was not him. He did not know about the Google Doc with the terms of the arrangement, or the burgundy bra, or the conversations at 1 a.m. that Rachel had with a stranger on her phone while he slept beside her with his sleep-tracking watch beeping softly on the nightstand. What Brian knew was this: he loved his wife. He had always loved his wife. And he was, if he was being honest with himself, which he tried to be, though the practice of self-honesty was not his strongest suit, somewhat bored. Not with Rachel specifically. With everything. With the commute and the project deadlines and the 8:08 meeting he had to attend on Thursday and the lawn that needed mowing on Saturday and a retirement account that was growing at exactly the rate the financial planner had projected. He was bored with the shape of his life, which was a thing he could not say out loud without sounding like a privileged, middle-aged man who did not appreciate what he had. So he did not say it. He kept it inside, the way he kept everything inside, in the vault of his own interior life where he stored his disappointments and his doubts and his unspoken longing for something, he could not name what, and he mowed the lawn and paid the mortgage and loved his wife the best way he knew how, which was not enough, which had never been enough, but which he did not know how to make better. One night in March, a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way, Brian came home from work and found Rachel at the kitchen table, her laptop open, a glass of wine at her elbow. She looked up when he came in, and she smiled at him, and the smile was warm and genuine and contained something that Brian could not identify but that made him feel, for a moment, like the man she had married 20 years ago instead of the man he had become. He smiled back. He said, "Hey, you." He put his bag down and kissed her on the top of her head and went to change out of his work clothes, and as he walked down the hallway toward the bedroom, he felt something shift in his chest, a small, tentative movement, like a seed beginning to split its shell. He did not know what it was. He would not have called it hope, because hope was not a word that Brian Morrison used lightly or accurately. But it was something. And that something was, perhaps, the beginning of the question he had never thought to ask: what am I missing? What have I been missing? And is it too late to go looking for it? He did not ask the question that night. He did not ask it for several more months. But the seed had been planted, and seed, given time and darkness, and the right conditions, have a way of growing whether you want them to or not. ## Part 8, the end of the beginning. Rachel ended it on a Sunday afternoon in June, a phone call, not in person, because in person felt too much like a breakup, and this was not a breakup, this was a closure, and the distinction mattered. She was sitting in her car in the parking lot of a Target in Matthews, North Carolina, A bag of groceries in the back seat and Emma's lacrosse equipment in the trunk, and Michael answered on the second ring as if he had been waiting for this call. "I can't do this anymore," she said. There was a long silence on the other end. When Michael spoke, his voice was calm. "Okay. Asterisk it's not because of anything you did. Or didn't do. It's because I'm losing myself. And I don't know how to stop that while this is happening, asterisk." "I understand," Michael said. And then, after another pause, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Are you going to tell him?" Rachel looked through the windshield at the Target entrance, where a young mother was wrestling a toddler into a shopping cart with the harried efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "I don't know," she said. Asterisk I don't think so. Not yet. Maybe not ever, asterisk. "And Brian?" he asked. "What's going to happen with you and Brian?" "I don't know that either," Rachel said. She could feel the tears coming, not yet, not quite, but close, the pressure building behind her eyes. Asterisk I think I need to figure out if there's a version of this marriage that works for me. If there isn't, if he truly cannot give me what I need, then I think I need to leave. Instead of doing what I've been doing, asterisk. "That's fair," Michael said. His voice was warm and sad and entirely without accusation. "I think that's the right call." "What about you?" she asked. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to go home," Michael said. Asterisk I'm going to spend more time with my kids. And I'm going to figure out if there's anything left to save with Susan. I don't know if there is. But I owe it to all of us to try, asterisk. They talked for another 15 minutes, not about the affair, not about their feelings, but about practical things. Their teams, their conferences, the upcoming quarterly reports they would both have to file. It was, Rachel thought, the strangest conversation she had ever had with another human being. It was a goodbye that sounded like a business handoff, and it was also the most honest conversation they had ever had, because by ending it, they had both finally admitted that what they had was real and that real things, when they end, leave a wound. "Take care of yourself, Rachel," Michael said at the end. "You too, Michael," she said. She hung up. She sat in the car for 5 minutes, her hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. Then she started the engine and drove home and carried the groceries inside and made dinner, spaghetti with meat sauce, Emma's favorite. And Brian came home from his Sunday golf game smelling of grass and sunshine and the particular contentment of a man who had spent the afternoon doing something he loved. And he kissed her on the cheek and said, "Something smells great." And Rachel said, "I'm glad you're home," and she meant it in a way that she had not meant it in years. She did not tell Brian. Not then. Not that summer, when the evenings were long and golden and the three of them, Brian, Rachel, Emma, seemed to orbit each other with a new and tentative grace, as if they had all, without knowing why, decided to try a little harder. They took a trip to Colorado that August, the anniversary trip they had been planning since February, and they hiked through Rocky Mountain National Park and ate trout at a restaurant in Estes Park and lay in bed at night in their rented cabin and listened to the sound of the wind through the pines. And Brian held her hand in the dark, and Rachel let him, and she thought, "This is the real thing. This is what I have. Is it enough?" She still did not know the answer. But she was, finally, asking the question honestly, which was more than she had done in years. In October, 3 months after she ended things with Michael, Rachel came home from work and found Brian sitting at the kitchen table, a thing he almost never did, because he was usually at his desk in the study by the time she got home, and he looked up at her with an expression she had not seen on his face in years, nervousness. Real, unfiltered nervousness. "Rach," he said. "Can we talk?" She sat down across from him. Of course. I've been thinking, he said. Asterisk about us. About whether you're happy, asterisk. Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. She sat very still. I've been a dumbass, Brian said. The word dumbass was so unexpected, so entirely unlike him, that Rachel felt a laugh rise in her throat and then immediately disappear. Asterisk, I know I've been distant for a long time. And I know I haven't been the husband I should have been. And I just want to say, I'm sorry. And I'm trying to figure out how to be better. If you'll let me, asterisk. Rachel looked at him. Her husband. The man she had lied to for a year. The man whose wife she was, still, in every legal and social and familiar sense. The man she had been so determined to protect from the truth that she had nearly destroyed herself trying to keep it. Brian, she said carefully, what made you want to have this conversation? He rubbed his face. He looked, she thought, older than he had 5 years ago, older and more tired and also, somehow, more present, as if the act of aging had finally burned away the comfortable fiction that he had everything figured out. I read something, he said. Asterisk on a forum. Someone linked to an article about emotional intimacy in long-term marriages, and I read it, and I thought, that's us. That's exactly what's happening to us. And I thought, I don't want to be that guy. The guy who let his marriage become a room he lives in but doesn't really live in. I want to be in it. With you, asterisk. Rachel did not know what to say. She was not crying. She had been cry-ready for a year, and the tears, when they came, would not stop, but for now she was in the strange, suspended state of a person who has been bracing for an impact that has finally arrived but has not yet registered as pain. Can we start over? Brian asked. Asterisk, not from scratch, but from here. Whatever here is, asterisk. Rachel reached across the table and took his hand. His palm was warm and slightly rough and familiar in a way that the heat of Michael's body had never been, because Brian's hand was home in a way that no hotel room could ever be, and the knowledge of this, the simple, obvious, devastating fact of it, broke her open. Yes, she said. Let's start over. This has been story 10 from Noah's Awakening. Because the bravest thing a woman can do is ask for what she needs, even if the answer terrifies her. ## part 9, the year after. The year after was the hardest of Rachel's life, and also, in ways she did not expect, the most clarifying. She did not tell Brian about Michael. The question of whether to tell him, whether he deserved to know, whether her silence was a betrayal or a gift, whether the truth would heal or destroy, was one she returned to every day for the first 3 months after the Target parking lot conversation. She turned it over in her mind the way she turned over a stone she had found on a beach, examining it from every angle, looking for the sharp edges, trying to determine if it was a treasure or a hazard. In the end, she made a decision that she could not fully explain. She would not tell him. Not because he did not deserve to know, he did, she understood that now, but because she did not know how to tell him in a way that would not feel like an attack. Brian had just started to wake up. He had just begun to ask the hard questions about himself and his marriage and the life they had built. If she told him now, she would be handing him a weapon to use against himself, a permanent record of her betrayal that he would carry for the rest of his life. And she did not know if the truth, which was, she believed, a form of freedom, was worth the destruction it would cause. So she carried the secret alone. She carried it to therapy, where she sat on a leather couch in a dimly lit office in South Park and told a therapist named Dr. Morrow, a 60-year-old woman with silver hair and a voice like warm honey, about the emptiness in her marriage and the hunger that had led her to the affair, without ever naming the affair itself. Dr. Morrow listened with the patient attention of someone who had heard everything and been surprised by nothing, and at the end of the first session, she said, "Asterisk, what I hear you saying is that you have been living in your marriage without being seen. And that is a profound kind of loneliness, asterisk." Rachel cried for 45 minutes after that session. She sat in her car in Dr. Morrow's parking garage with the engine running and the radio playing a soft rock ballad she did not recognize, and she cried until she could not cry anymore. And then she drove home and made dinner and did not mention therapy to Brian, because the therapy was hers, and the grief was hers, and some things had to stay private even in a marriage that was trying to learn how to be honest again. Brian was, to his credit, genuinely trying. He started making changes, small ones at first, then larger ones. He came home from work earlier, most days by 6 p.m., instead of retreating to his study until dinner time. He started asking Rachel about her day, not the perfunctory housework that had been his habitual opener for years, but real questions, follow-up questions, the kind of questions that suggested he was actually listening to the answers. He planned a date night, a real date night, at a restaurant in uptown Charlotte that Rachel had mentioned wanting to try, and he hired a babysitter and drove her there and held her hand across the table and told her, with a sincerity that was almost painful to witness, that he wanted their marriage to be something they both chose every day, not something they just happened to be living in. Rachel did not know what to do with this new Brian. She had spent so many years of silence and distance and the slow calcification of their relationship, believing that he was simply not capable of this. That the passivity was structural, baked into his personality, as load-bearing as the bridges he designed. And now here he was, changing, growing, becoming someone who could meet her in the place as she needed to be met, and she was filled with a gratitude so intense it was almost indistinguishable from grief. Because she knew something Brian did not know, she had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She had already done a thing she could not take back. And no amount of Brian's new attentiveness, no amount of couples therapy or date nights or hard conversations could erase the fact that she had been unfaithful, that she had lied, that she had chosen herself over her marriage in a way that was permanent and irreversible. She told Dr. Morrow this, not about Michael specifically, but about the shape of her guilt, the architecture of her deception. "I have done something I cannot undo," she said. Asterisk, and now I am trying to rebuild something on a foundation that has a crack in it. Is that even possible? Asterisk. Dr. Morrow was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, asterisk, every marriage has cracks. Every person who has ever lived has done something they are not proud of. The question is not whether the foundation is perfect. The question is whether both people want to build asterisk. Rachel thought about this for a long time. They started couples therapy in January, 4 months after the Target parking lot conversation, 3 months after Colorado. Their therapist was a man named Dr. Robert Kessler, a broadly built man with a gentle voice and a talent for asking questions that made both of them uncomfortable in exactly the ways they needed to be uncomfortable. He did not take sides. He did not suggest that the marriage was irretrievably broken or irretrievably whole. He simply sat in his chair and asked them questions. Asterisk, when did you first feel alone in this marriage? What did you want from Brian that you were afraid to ask for? What do you think Rachel needs that you have not been giving her, Brian? What do you think Brian needs that you have not been seeing, Rachel? Asterisk. Rachel answered these questions with a rigor that surprised even her. She talked about her childhood, the emotional distance of her mother, the way she had learned to suppress her own needs in order to keep the peace, and how that pattern had replayed itself in her marriage. She talked about the specific things she had wanted from Brian, more touch, more words, more of the kind of attention that made her feel like she was a person he was choosing rather than a fixture he had acquired. Brian listened. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. He just listened with the same expression of concentrated attention that he brought to his engineering problems, and at the end of the first session, he said, *, I didn't know. I had no idea you felt this way, *. I know, Rachel said. I didn't tell you. Why not? She looked at him. *, because I didn't think you would hear me. And I was afraid of being wrong, *. Brian absorbed this. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He just absorbed it, and Rachel watched him absorb it, watched the information move through him like a wave through water, shifting things, reshaping the internal architecture of his understanding, and she felt, for the first time in years, that she was actually being heard. The couple's therapy continued through the spring. They learned to argue differently, not by retreating into silence, the way Brian had always done, or by escalating into histrionics, the way Rachel had learned to do when she felt she was not being listened to. They learned to ask for things directly. They learned to sit with discomfort without treating it as a crisis. They learned, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks that left them both frustrated and exhausted, how to be married to each other in a way that felt like a choice rather than an arrangement. Rachel did not know if it would last. She did not know if Brian would continue to grow, or if he would eventually slide back into the comfortable passivity that had defined their marriage for so many years. She did not know if she would ever fully forgive herself for the affair, or if the guilt would become a permanent feature of her interior landscape, shaping every interaction she had with her husband in ways she could not fully perceive or control. She knew only this: she was no longer the woman who had walked into that hotel room in Savannah and closed the door behind her. She was someone else now, someone who had been seen, and had seen herself, and had been forced to reckon with the full complexity of her own capacity for self-deception and self-destruction and, against all odds, self-reconstruction. Whether that was redemption or merely survival, she could not yet say. But she was still standing. And for now, for this morning, this afternoon, this evening with Brian and Emma at the dinner table in their house in the Charlotte suburbs, that was enough. Part 10, The Other Woman's Life. Rachel thought about Susan often, more often than she was comfortable admitting. Susan Tran, whose LinkedIn profile Rachel had studied with the forensic attention of a detective, whose Facebook photos she had scrolled through late at night while Brian slept beside her, whose life she had reconstructed from fragments and public posts and one overheard phone call in which Michael had said, "Yeah, the kids are with Susan's mom this weekend," before going quiet and then saying, "Yeah, okay. See you Sunday." Susan was, by all appearances, a successful woman. She worked as a hospital administrator at a large medical center in suburban Houston. She had a master's degree in healthcare administration from the University of Texas. She posted photos of her children, Derek's baseball games, Kayla's nursing school graduation, with captions that were warm and proud and free of the subtext that Rachel had learned to read in her own posts. She was not, by any objective measure, an unhappy woman. She was a woman who had built a life, who had raised 2 children, who had a career and a community and a social circle that revolved around her husband's professional network and her own professional network and the intersecting circles of 2 lives that had, over 22 years of marriage, grown so intertwined that it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. Was Susan happy? Rachel did not know. She suspected that the question, applied to any marriage of more than 20 years, was almost meaningless. Happiness was a weather pattern, not a destination. It came and went. What you built with another person was not happiness. It was something more structural, more load-bearing. It was the ability to withstand the happiness droughts and the seasons of boredom and the long, gray stretches when neither person could remember why they had chosen each other in the first place. Rachel wondered what would happen if Susan found out. She imagined it often, the conversation she would have to have, the apology she would owe, the look on Susan's face when she realized that the pleasant, unremarkable woman she had never met was the person who had been sleeping with her husband in hotel rooms across the southeast. Would Susan blame herself? Would she blame Michael? Would she do what Rachel would do, which was to examine her own marriage with a forensic eye and identify the moment, the night, the conversation, the specific act of neglect, when things had begun to go wrong? Rachel did not think Michael's marriage was her fault. She did not think her own marriage was Brian's fault, or that her affair was Brian's fault, or that any of the suffering that was embedded in this situation had a single author. The suffering was systemic. It was the suffering of two marriages that had quietly, without either party noticing or admitting it, stopped being partnerships and become arrangements. And arrangements, however functional, eventually calcify into prisons, and prisons make people desperate, and desperate people do things that are wrong but that feel, in the moment of doing them, entirely justified. She tried not to think about this too often. It kept her up at night, and the sleeplessness was beginning to show, in the faint shadows under her eyes, in the way she sometimes lost her train of thought mid-sentence during presentations, and the slightly brittle quality of her laugh when Karen made a joke about marriage being the ultimate marathon. The ultimate something, Rachel had said, and Karen had laughed, not knowing what she was laughing at. ## epilogue, The Reckoning. 1 year after ending things with Michael, Rachel was sitting on the back porch of her house in Charlotte, watching the sun go down over the suburban landscape, the neighbors' yards, the distant highway, the sky turning shades of orange and pink that she had stopped noticing years ago but that she was, in the aftermath of everything, beginning to see again. Brian was inside, making dinner. He was making pasta, her favorite, because it was their anniversary, and he had made a reservation at the restaurant in uptown Charlotte but had also decided, this year, to cook, because Rachel had mentioned once, in therapy, that she missed the dinners he used to make when they were first married, before the kids and the career and the slow drift into routine had eroded the rituals they used to share. Emma was at college, UNC Chapel Hill, a 3-hour drive away, close enough that she came home most weekends but far enough that Rachel was beginning to feel the particular ache of a mother learning to let go. Emma had called that morning to say she was staying on campus for the weekend, a paper, a group project, friends in town, and Rachel had said, "Okay, sweetie, I love you," and had meant it, and had also felt the strange relief of having Brian to herself for the weekend, the quiet of a house with only 2 people in it. She was thinking about the past year. About therapy, individual and couples. About the hard conversations, the ones she had initiated and the ones Brian had initiated, and the ones neither of them had initiated but that had happened anyway, in the spaces between dinner and bedtime and the long Sunday afternoons when there was nothing to do but sit with each other and be. She was thinking about the things she had not told Brian. The affair. The hotel rooms. The man whose name she no longer spoke, not because it hurt too much but because it had become irrelevant, a chapter closed, a wound healed over, a scar that she touched sometimes in the dark and was grateful for because it meant she had survived. She did not know if she would ever tell him. She had come to believe, over the past year, that the answer was probably no, that the truth, at this point, would serve no purpose except punishment, and that punishment was not the same as justice, and that she had already punished herself more severely than any confession could. But she also knew that she might change her mind. That the question would probably live with her for the rest of her life, a small stone in her shoe that she had learned to walk with but never quite gotten used to. She heard Brian moving around in the kitchen. The smell of garlic and olive oil drifted through the screen door. He was humming something, a song she did not recognize, and the sound of it made her chest tighten with a feeling she had not expected to feel again, gratitude. Not for the marriage she had or the man she was married to, exactly, but for the fact that she was still here. Still trying. Still standing on the back porch of her life, watching the sun go down, with someone inside who was making her dinner. She went inside. Brian was at the stove, stirring a sauce, and he looked up and smiled when she walked in, and the smile was the same smile she had fallen in love with 20 years ago, open, uncomplicated, entirely without agenda, and she walked over to him and put her arms around him from behind and rested her head on his shoulder. "Smells good," she said. "It's the sauce from that place in the West Village," he said. Remember? When we went to New York for your conference, that one time, I remember, she said. She did not tell him about New Orleans. She did not tell him about the Grand Ole Opryland Hotel or the earrings from the card on Market Street or the conversation in the bar in Atlanta when Michael had said, "This is the first honest thing I've done in 20 years. She held him, and he stirred the sauce, and the moment passed, and nothing was different, and everything was different. "Happy anniversary, Ratch," Brian said. "Happy anniversary, Bree," she said. And she meant it. Not the way she had meant it in the early years, with the breathless, uncomplicated certainty of someone who believed that love was a destination you arrived at and stayed forever. She meant it the way you mean a vow you have made and broken and remade, seriously, deliberately, with full knowledge of its cost. She meant it because it was the only kind of love she knew how to have now, the kind that knows its own fragility and chooses to continue anyway. This has been Story 10 from Noah's Awakening, for the women who have loved too quietly and are finally learning to speak. #author's note, the things we carry. There is a particular kind of truth-telling that happens only in the aftermath, in the quiet months and years after a crisis has passed, when the adrenaline has faded and the body has had time to recalibrate to a new normal. It is in these aftermath moments that people make the decisions that will define the rest of their lives, whether to stay, whether to leave, whether to speak the truth that has been living in their chest like a second heartbeat, or whether to let it stay buried, protected by the very silence that created the wound in the first place. Rachel made her choice. She stayed. She did not tell Brian. She carried the secret into the next phase of her marriage, into the therapy sessions and the date nights and the long, slow work of reconstruction, and she carried it not as a burden but as a teacher. She learned from it. She let it inform her choices without letting it dictate them. She built a marriage that was, by any external measure, better than the one she had been living in before, more honest, more intimate, more chosen. Whether the secret at its center made it illegitimate, she could not say. She suspected that the answer was yes, and she suspected that the answer was no, and she had come to believe that both answers could be true simultaneously, because the architecture of a human life was not a building but a weather pattern, and weather patterns do not follow the rules of structural engineering. What she knew for certain was this: she was still here. Still trying. Still standing on the back porch of her life, watching the sun go down, with someone inside who was making her dinner. And that, in the end, was the only truth that mattered. Some nights, when Brian had fallen asleep beside her and the house was quiet, Rachel would lie awake and think about the year before, the hotels, the texts, the slow build of anticipation and release that had kept her alive for 12 months when she might otherwise have succumbed to the quiet death of a marriage that was not working. She thought about Michael, not with longing, not anymore, but with a kind of austere gratitude, the way you might feel about a surgery that was painful but necessary. He had given her something, in those months. Not just the sex, though the sex had been good, better than good, transformative in its aliveness. He had given her proof. Proof that she was still capable of wanting, of reaching, of being seen by another person in the full dimensionality of her hunger. He had given her back to herself, in other words, and then she had taken what he gave her and walked away. And the walking away was the hardest part, harder than the lying, because the lying she had gotten good at. But the leaving required a kind of moral courage that she had not known she possessed until she was standing in the parking lot of a Target in Matthews, North Carolina, ending the most honest relationship she had ever had. She did not regret it. That was the thing she could not explain to anyone, least of all herself, the absence of regret. She had done something wrong. She had lied. She had betrayed her marriage and her husband and the trust that he, however imperfectly, had placed in her. And she did not regret it, because the alternative, the slow suffocation of a life unlived, the quiet death of a woman who had once wanted everything and ended up with almost nothing, would have been worse. Would have been, in some fundamental and unarguable sense, worse. Brian stirred in his sleep. He reached for her in the dark, not sexually, just a reflexive, half-conscious reaching, the body's memory of the person beside it, and Rachel took his hand and held it, and she did not know if this was redemption or merely survival, but she knew that she was still here, still holding on, still choosing to be present in a life that had surprised her with its complexity and its capacity for both damage and repair. That was enough. For now, that was enough.